Now, I'm going to be taking you through a set of images of works by women artists. This is in no particular chronological order. What I've instead done is to take up specific thematics. So you will see the repetition of several names of artists coming up time and again, depending on the context in which I'm speaking of their work. The sort of most sort of important trope has been the site of the body, right? The body was taken up by women artists as the site, the quintessential sort of site of representation. It was the carrier of memory, the bearer of violence, experience, and much more. And within that, one of the sort of let's say categories that was taken up by women artists was that of portraiture, right? Amrita Shergill, one of India's foremost modernist artists, is, and you can see here the self-portrait of the artist, drawing on a long legacy of self-portraiture, right? Predominantly, again, a male sort of practice, of claims for a woman artist's work to be taken seriously, of the woman artist to be taken seriously as a professional, yet at times rendering it with playfulness and intimacy. There is the work of Rekha Rodvitya, which again sort of draws on a vast legacy of traditional symbolisms and metaphors associated with femininity, masculinity, and bringing them together to compose a new subject, as it were. There is also the work of Gogi Saroj Pal, where you can see that the body is at times sort of stripped bare, exposing the world to the inner lives and pains of being a woman. At times freeing the body, mutating it with mythological creatures to produce these sort of new beings with different strengths, different potencies. There is the work of Mithu Sen, where what takes place is a great deal of disembodiment, sort of violent superimposition at times of one's face onto other bodies. At other times, you can see, such as in the work below, so the reducing of a strong male body to a very transparent and fragile sort of outline that can be pierced, wounded, reduced to bare bones, as it were. There is also the work of Anju Dodia, where the self-portrait becomes really the predominant sort of way that the artist sort of explores various issues pertaining to autobiography, where the body is registered as a site of productive tension between speech and utterances, between one's interiority and exterior sort of reality. Here we see the artist drawing, sort of almost positioning herself in the place of the artist, Hokusai, and with the hands positioned almost as if they were themselves making, or creating the waves. We also have the work of Shiba Chachi, where the body is sort of understood as an invitation to perform the self, as the artist herself terms it, reworking powers of the gaze, acts of representation, questions of agency. On the right, we have a work where the body becomes this site through which one might explore sort of the process of aging, the laboring body, forms of governmentality that come to sort of govern the body, in a sense. Or in the work of Dayanita Singh, once again, of a very straightforward gaze, and producing this really sort of site of tension. The image on the left, you have presumably a child bride about to be married, seated in front of a gallery of portraits of forefathers, mothers, gods, religious symbols, and yet gazing into the camera with charm, right? It produces this very sort of unsettling tension, and one that can also be experienced through a very sort of complex staging of gazes. We also have the work of Meera Mukherjee, where in this image you have Meera Mukherjee is seated in the middle of the laboring sort of body of the artist, almost as a craftswoman, laboring and wielding her tools in much the same way as an artisan, a weaver, a stonebreaker perhaps. And then we have the work of Madhavi Parekh, who, I mean, in this work especially, we can see that there is a refiguring of the female deity, Durga, and reinvesting it with the kind of folk motifs and narratives out of which they were pulled out. If portraiture was one of those predominant sort of modes, the question of violence was also sort of addressed by several artists, and even in the images that we've seen before, there is this address of the body as a site of violence. You have the work of Nilima Sheikh, imagining the life of a girl who was murdered by her husband's family over dowry money. In the work there, from the series When Champa Grew Up. Work that explores really the precariousness of women's lives, of women bearing or having to bear the burden of collective mourning. Again, in the work of Shiba Chachi, of widows who have no place or no standing in society, outcasts, often choosing to become ascetics or mendicants, forced to give up all relationships, and now considered daughters of the river Ganges, which is a traditional sort of euphemism for Hindu widows. We also have artists taking up sort of innocuous everyday objects, which sort of become tools of violence, right? The scissor, the scale, artists such as Anju Dodia, I mean, whose works really take up the confrontation of the fragile body with sort of something as jagged and broken as these shards of mirrors. Works by Mithu Sen of membranes and bodies sort of pierced almost internally through wounds. Then we have the work of Anita Dubé, exploring sort of aspects of the erotic sort of gaze, of trauma. This is a series of works called Silence, Blood, Wedding, done in 1997, where she collected these human bones, then cleaned and covered them with red velvet, trimmed with beads and lace, producing these sort of counter fetish objects. The work named after Federico Garcia Lorca's drama of love and fraternal violence, Silence. And then we have a lot of artists having sort of engaged with processes of normativization, of gender as something that is not sort of innate or inherent, but as something that has been performed, right? And women artists have dealt with these in various ways, but oftentimes drawing on references from earlier works of earlier artists. So you can see Amrita Shergill's very deliberate portrait, self-portrait as a Tahitian. There is the work of Anupam Sood, particularly the work on the right, which sort of explores the performativity, acts of masquerade and staging that we see in a lot of performance traditions where you have female impersonators, for instance. Or this series by Dayanita Singh called Master G, where she follows the choreographer Saroj Khan and the ways in which cinema reiterates certain sort of stereotypes about gender. Or this performance piece by Anita Dubé, where fitted with a pair of sort of silver silver contact lenses, she walks the streets as a hermaphroditic dandy, her silver begging bowl sort of refracting invisible moonbeams in an act of shared madness. And then we have the more deliberate restaging of images, references to Raja Ravi Verma that we saw earlier in the work of Pushpamala N. Of female figures, but also referencing back the native sort of type, as you can see in the image below, of a sort of critique on the colonial sort of anthropological project. As well as popular representations of Mother India and so on. Or of Anju Dudia's work, where you can see the artist sort of positioning herself almost like this goddess who is attacking the canvas. We also have the work of Tejal Shah, who in this series, for instance, uses the prefix trans to investigate multiple sort of possibilities of the word trans. Trans could be transform, transfix, transit, translate, transgender, thank you, transfer, transient, transvestite, transnational, transliterate, such that the word trans itself becomes both metaphor and conceptual tool. This series, again, where she refers back to earlier works such as by Ravi Verma and so on. Or the work of Sonia Khurana, where we see that there is the body which is almost at odds with its own flesh, that is sort of fighting the laws of gravity as the artist attempts to sort of take flight, liberating the body, in an attempt at liberating the body from its own sort of conditioned ways of being. And we see here a nude female body that does not conform to canons of beauty, and in that sense can be read as a critique on the condition of womanhood itself. The work of the artist Navjot Altaf, who interacted with sex workers for this series, exploring the notion of touch, right? Exploring, touch around, and looking at it in relationship to the question of choice. Who chooses to touch? Who chooses not to be touched, of undesired touch, right? And can touch be thought of as a mode of knowledge? And then we have the work of Dayanita Singh, this series, Myself, Mona Ahmed, which explores the interior sort of life and experiences of a eunuch, Mona Ahmed. We also have a lot of artists who engage with questions of community and identity, foremost among which is the work of Rumana Hussain, considered to be one of the earliest sort of performance artists in India, whose practice really took a turn in the early sort of 1990s after the demolition of a mosque which was known as the Babri Masjid, which was demolished in 1992, following which the city of Bombay particularly witnessed severe riots and violence against the Muslim community in India. So you had Rumana Hussain beginning to think about what it meant to be a Muslim woman in India at that point of time, and finding an answer in performance art. So you see sort of this artist performing with her mouth opened in a silent sort of scream, engaging with, testimonies of forgotten histories. Or one of her last works, Is It What You Think?, where the artist sat on a chair in black lace underwear, wearing a parandhi, which is a large sort of artificial braid, partially revealing the scars from her mastectomy and her prosthesis, both visible beneath a black veil. And there were projections of images of young women holding guns, which flashed across her torso. While Rumana Hussain was reading a text as part of this performance, and the text goes, where does she belong? Have you defined her? Has she fought for her rights? Does she clean, sweep, and cook for her family? Has she a lover? Has she been mutilated? Is that fact or fiction? We also have the work of the artist Vasudha Thorur, who particularly in the 2000s, from the following the Gujarat riots of 2002, began to engage with communities, especially of women whose lives and households were entirely destroyed by the riots. And here you have on the left a portrait of one of those women with whom Vasudha worked very closely with for almost a decade. On the right, the monkey, which has a lot of symbolic sort of and various kinds of symbolisms in India. You have on the one hand the Gandhi's three monkeys of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. But then you also have the monkey from the Ramayana who sets fire on the city of Lanka. And you have the artist sort of juxtaposing these two things, these two sort of histories and mythologies in the context of sort of the violence. The artist also did a workshop with girls and with children in these riot affected areas. Once again, the work of Nilima Sheikh, particularly pertaining to Kashmir, where the task of mourning once again falls on women whose children, husbands, families have been disappeared. Of entire communities of theater performers, such as the Bhand performance in Kashmir, which was wiped out. And then you also have artists such as Navjot Altaf, who's worked with tribal communities in central India, such as in Bastar, working with them to produce sort of community art projects, but which would be in the form of creating infrastructure. So whether it was in the form of creating water tanks, places for them to gather, sit, etc. Women artists also have a very sort of critical and interesting take on history. For instance, Nilima's sort of introduction of the figure of Akka Mahadevi, who was a medieval poetess. Shukla Savant and her work, Remembering Pandita, which looks back at one of the sort of foremost figures of the women's movement, Pandita Ramabai, who is a very staunch critic, of patriarchy as well as the caste system. Artists who look at stereotypes of gender in illustrated books. And these illustrated books particularly sort of focus on characters from Hindu mythology or from Indian history. So what happens when you intervene into this domain? Or artists such as Nalini Malani, who explore sort of, again, testimonies of women, but also of the violent sort of experience of partition, the partition of India and Pakistan, in several of her works. And finally, the work of Arpita Singh, who sort of presents the Mother India figure here almost as a widow, whose works engage with sort of various forms of violence, particularly the violence of men, be it in mythology, be it in history, or even the present. And I come to the last part of the presentation, which is the very sort of peculiar and particular use of materials, media, and techniques by women artists. So you have, for instance, the work of Mrinalini Mukherjee in her use of hemp and jute, and forging a practice which could not at that time be accommodated within departments of sculpture, mural, textiles. So really sort of forging a practice that really found no place within any sort of fine art discipline, so to speak. Artists using cloth, scrolls, and stencils, traditional techniques as ways of speaking of issues of tradition, issues relating to tradition. The staged photography, again, as one of the other sort of techniques used by artists. The figure on the right is Urvashi Butalia, a historian writer whose book, The Other Side of Silence, was one of the most sort of path-breaking works in terms of bringing out sort of oral testimonies around the partition and experiences of women, people belonging to the lower castes, and so on. She is also the co-founder of what was India's first feminist publishing house, which was called Kali for Women, and now runs a publishing house called Zuban, a very important figure for the women's movement as well. Video installation being yet another technique adopted by several artists, from Nalini Malani to Shiba Chachi, Sonia Khurana. Installation itself is something that was explored by several artists. The work on the left is a work done by Shilpa Gupta in collaboration with the Asiad Archive in 2015, part of a project that was called That Photo We Never Got, looking at the relationship of documents in the archive, testimonies, stories that can and cannot be told by the archive, but also works such as by Sheila Gowda on the right, which use everyday and mundane everyday objects, such as cow dung over here, cakes of cow dung. Or the work of Sharmila Samant on the left, which uses sort of the bottle caps of sort of Coca-Cola and other sort of those bottles. The use of hair, for instance, such as in works by Mithu Sen. The use of the bindi, again, one of the most sort of common objects that is worn on the forehead by, Hindu women, but again, sort of refigured and reused and retold in very different ways. Or the work of Benita Persil here in her use of brick, her use of found objects, as well as a lot of materials such as herbs, gums, very locally found objects out of which she makes her sculpture. I have not sort of touched upon sort of several issues, such as the role of women in the art school, such as landmark exhibitions of women's groups, women artist collectives, etc. But I think I will stop and end my presentation here, and I hope that we can discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.